Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I'll be ranting about China and how China is not going to be the world's number one economy or a global leader in any of our lifetimes. Now, looking here, we have a few articles about China. Philippines condemns China's floating barrier in South China Sea. Investors in China scramble to sell overseas properties amid shaky economic conditions. Biden aids in talks with Vietnam for arms deal that could hurt China. EU does not want to decouple from China but must protect itself, says EU trade chief. Biden to host Pacific Island leaders, and this is going to be very offensive against China. And China's central bank advisors proposes structural reforms to revive the economy. Now, it's quite obvious to see that China is in a decline, and for those who still have the pipe dream that China is going to be the world's number one economy, seems to not understand how things are functioning in the world right now. Let's see what are the main problems facing China right now. Okay, so one of the biggest problems that's facing China right now is its economic challenges. China's rapid economic growth over the past 50 years has been a significant driver of its rise into the global stage. Unfortunately, this economic rise has all been due to the fact that they have been able to trade openly, freely with every other country on earth without restrictions. This also was taken advantage of by many Western nations who decided to offshore most of their productions to China, which really helped boost China's productivity, at the same time reduce the productivity of most Western nations. Now this is coming to bite back the Western nations, and that is why most Western economies are trying to pull back their manufacturing back into their own country. This is going to be a major blow to China because China is not prepared to lose most of its manufacturing capabilities, at least in terms of the technological advancements that has been provided by the Western nations. Now, let's talk about the political instability. China is definitely not a politically stable country. Okay, in fact, to say it even has a reasonable political environment is not very fair, simply because China is run by a one-man show, and the one man is dictator Xi. Now, if Xi was like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, which seems to be the only successful dictatorship in the world that the world has ever seen, then maybe China might have hope. Unfortunately, nothing the Chinese people or the Chinese leader does is for their country. It is all for the individual. And because everything is done for the individual empowerment and individual enrichment, you sacrifice your country in the process. This is the canary in the coal mine for many other countries in the world who thinks that they could follow the Chinese economic growth model for the past 50 years and make their countries even more successful. Many of these Western leaders even now under the impression that following this particular path will lead you to become a successful nation. Unfortunately, these are just short-term band-aids that does not actually solve the underlying problem. Or one of the biggest unfortunate circumstances that arises from this is the simple fact that they did not take into account a demographic collapse. What is a demographic collapse? It basically means in the next 10 to 20 years, you will have less people in your country than you would now. And when I mean less people, I'm not talking about the overall population. I'm talking about less people that will be able to contribute to the economy. Once you retire, once you exceed 65 to 70 years old, your productivity and contribution to the economy declines drastically. And as more and more people age, and as there's more and more older people compared to younger people, there will be more strain on the Medicare services and all the welfare services. And this just means the country is going to now have to drain more money to support its older generation and less money to actually develop the nation or the country. So this demographic collapse is happening everywhere in the world, and China would be the poster boy in terms of how this actually takes place in slow motion. Now, besides the demographic issues, we've got the geopolitical tensions. Instead of making friends with its neighbors, instead of trying to build healthier relationships and better trade practices with its neighbors, what is China doing? It's intimidating most of its neighbors. Most of the ASEAN countries are right now completely against China and all of its authoritarian view on how it rules most of the South China Sea. It is making more enemies than friends. There's a discontent with China's method of handling the circumstances with its neighbors. And this content is getting worse and worse every day, and China is not backing down. Instead of consolidating and trying to build better relationships with its neighbors, what China is doing is the opposite. It's intimidating its neighbors and making its relationships in the South China Sea and in the ASEAN region much, much worse. This does not bode well for the future of China. Unfortunately, this is not what China is thinking about. All China is thinking about is expanding its territory and making it look like China is the greatest country in the world, even though it is not. One of the main problems faced by China right now is an ideological blind side. And that is, in China, most people are cut off from the world. Therefore, most of the citizens in China do not really understand the circumstance they are in. When a nation does not understand what's going on, it is only natural for them to blindly follow whoever that is spewing out the most pleasant rhetoric. And in China, playing the nationalistic card is what the CCP has been doing to garner the support of the Chinese people at their own cost. The Chinese people are losing, yet they don't have any other option because they're not being given any information. Now, this lack of information is not even misinformation or disinformation. This is no information. And this is what most Western nations now are actually trying to do. They're trying to censor everything online so that people do not have options. Options in thought. Not options in the real world, but options in thought. Because before you can actually take action in the real world, you need to have an idea, you need to have a thought. And when you suppress the ability for people to have options of thought, you tend to work towards a circumstance like China. So China is basically the poster boy for what most Western countries are trying to implement. Without realizing, the implementation of such a circumstance or system is only going to lead to the eventual demise of the whole society. Not many people in this era tends to think forward or think in the future because instant gratification has become a daily routine for most people in the world today. Thanks to social media, nobody really cares about the future because what's most important is right here, right now. If I want something, I need to get it now. And when I get it now, I feel good. And this has caused there to be a widespread inability for most human beings to actually think about the consequences of their actions in the future. Part of this is also due to a certain level of selfishness that has increased in society, whereby, so what if things happen in the future? I won't be around, I'll be dead. And this is most likely true simply because most people are not married or do not have children. When you're not married and you don't have children, you don't think about anybody else but yourself. And as society's birth rate declines, as the number of families declines, as the number of marriages declines, and the number of divorces increases, all we are having is a society that no longer cares about the future and only cares about themselves. Nobody cares about their offspring or the offspring's offsprings or their ancestral line. No, none of that. It's all about me, myself, and I. How this is going to play out is actually quite simple. The future is going to have much less people. There's going to be a whole economic change that is going to sweep the world over the next 50 years. We are a community and a society that needs to work together in order to actually bring prosperity. And if everyone continues this path, China will be our greatest example of how abandoning most of these values is going to lead us to a demise that nobody actually wants. So we should all start thinking about the future, and the future not in tomorrow or next week, but in the next 10 to 20 years or the next 50 years. And how would we like life to be? Well, I'll leave you all with that thought for today. Thank you for staying till the end of the rant. I'll see you again tomorrow with more news. Thank you. Please like, share and subscribe, and take care.